5 weird historical facts you may not know. Number 1. Einstein's brain was stolen and went missing for decades. It might sound like the plot of a sci-fi B-movie, but Einstein's brain really was stolen shortly after his passing. In the 19th century, the brains of geniuses were often preserved so that scientists could try to determine the origins of that person's intelligence. For example, half of the brain of Charles Babbage, inventor of the first computing machine, is still on display at the Hunterian Museum at London's Royal College of Surgeons. Einstein was aware that scientists might want to study his brain after his passing and explicitly forbade it, knowing that such studies rarely produce useful information. Nevertheless, when Einstein passed at Princeton Hospital in the early morning of April 18, 1955, the pathologist who examined him, Dr. Thomas Harvey, decided to remove the brain on his own initiative for future study. Dr. Harvey took Einstein's brain home, divided it into 240 pieces and stored it in 2 mason jars filled with celloidin. Shortly after Einstein's cremation, his son Hans Albert found out about the theft and was furious. But Dr. Harvey convinced him to let him keep the brain. Taking the brain of the world's most famous physicist without permission did have professional consequences for Dr. Harvey. He soon lost both his job at Princeton Hospital and his marriage, then moved to the Midwest where he took a series of jobs either practicing medicine or running research labs. He kept Einstein's brain for the next several decades, at one point storing it in a cider box underneath a beer cooler, hoping to unlock the secrets of Einstein's intelligence. The fate of Einstein's brain was mostly unknown until 1978, when a reporter tracked Harvey down in Wichita, Kansas. The magazine article about Harvey brought a flood of requests for samples of the brain to study, and starting in 1985, scientists began publishing their findings. Many of these studies did claim to find some differences between Einstein's brain and that of a normal person, but they also lacked representative control groups, making their findings suspect. And even if these studies had been conducted more effectively, neurology still hasn't determined whether the physical structures of the brain actually affect a person's intelligence. Today, what remains of Einstein's brain resides at the Penn Medicine Princeton Medical Center in Plainsboro, New Jersey. Almost nobody is allowed to see it, not even researchers. But many more pieces of Einstein's brain can possibly still be found across America, thanks to Dr. Harvey's habit of giving away pieces of it to curious friends. Number 2. The most kissed girl in the world is a 19th-century drowned teen whose face was the model for a CPR dummy. During the late 19th century in Paris, a body of a girl presumed to be a teenager who drowned herself was pulled from the Seine River. In an attempt to identify the unknown girl, authorities put her body on display in a mortuary, but no one came forward to identify the teen, who became known as L'inconnue de la Seine, the unknown woman of the Seine. According to an article in the BMJ, a doctor who conducted an autopsy was struck by the serene look on the girl's face and created a plaster cast, or death mask, of her countenance. Replicas were made of the mask, which went on to become the model for a CPR dummy's face. In the late 1950s and 60s, when mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and CPR were invented, Archer Gordon of the American Heart Association noticed that medical students who practiced CPR could end up hurting each other. So he and another doctor, Bjorn Lind, asked a toymaker, Asmund Lerdahl, to create a mannequin students could practice on. Lerdahl had seen a replica of the mask of L'inconnue de la Seine, and used it for a female mannequin dubbed Resusci Anne, or Annie, because it looked so peaceful and wouldn't be intimidating. According to the Lerdahl Company, which still makes the mannequins, about 300 million people have been trained using Resusci Anne, so she has earned the title of the most kissed girl in the world. Number 3. Isaac Newton actually was inspired by an apple falling from a tree. We've all heard a version of the story of how Isaac Newton discovered gravity. It usually goes something like, Isaac Newton discovered gravity while he was sitting under an apple tree and an apple fell on his head. It definitely sounds made up, like the George Washington chopping down the cherry tree story, which is definitely a myth. Yet according to Newton and his biographers, that is pretty much how it happened. In 1665, Newton was studying at Cambridge University when an outbreak of bubonic plague forced him to quarantine at his parents' farm. There, Newton observed an apple falling to the ground and began to wonder why objects always fall downward, and not in another direction. The apple probably didn't fall on his head, though. Historians are even confident that they've identified the specific tree Newton observed, a flower of Kent apple tree at Woolsthorpe Manor. The tree was likely planted in 1650 and partially collapsed in a storm in 1816. But the tree recovered, and pieces of it have been used to grow more Newton trees. The original tree still stands today, and its descendants can be found on 6 continents. Number 4. The New England Vampire Panic. In 1882, in Exeter, Rhode Island, Mary Eliza Brown died of tuberculosis. Known at the time as consumption, the disease literally consumed people, causing the body to rapidly deteriorate, along with intense fevers and nasty coughs. But Mary Eliza wasn't the only victim in the Brown family. Her daughter Mary Olive passed away in 1883, and about a decade later, 19-year-old Mary Lena Brown also died of consumption. Mary Lena's brother, Edwin, was incredibly ill as well. Hoping a better climate would improve his condition, the young man went west. Unfortunately, when he returned, he was only getting worse. And that's when his neighbors developed a truly bizarre idea. What if one of the Brown women was crawling out of her grave at night and feasting on Edwin's blood? Wouldn't that explain his sickly condition? Determined to get to the bottom of things, a group of men exhumed all 3 women. Mary Eliza and Mary Olive were basically just bones, but when they brought out Mary Lena, her body was still fresh. After the vampire hunters cut open her heart, they found chunks of coagulated blood. Certain she was an undead monster, they burned Mary's heart and liver, and fed the ashes to Edwin. Obviously, Mary Brown wasn't a vampire. So why was her corpse in such good shape? Well, for one thing, she'd only been dead for a few months. Plus, Mary died in January, when it was freezing outside. Since it was winter and too cold to dig, her body had been stored in a stone vault, which acted as a refrigerator, thus preserving her corpse. Also, since she wasn't a vampire, the macabre cure didn't work on Edwin, and he died a few months later. Number 5. Pope Stephen VI put his deceased predecessor on trial. The story of the Cadaver Synod is kind of like the 9th century version of the McDonald's hot coffee lawsuit. On the surface it sounds silly, but once you learn the facts, it actually makes sense. In the 9th century, the Pope had the power to crown the Holy Roman Emperor. This meant that popes were involved with political intrigue, and many of them didn't live long after assuming office. Stephen VI's predecessor, Formosus, reluctantly crowned the Duke of Spoleto as the Holy Roman Emperor and later crowned the Duke's son, Lambert. In 896, Formosus reversed course and crowned one of his allies, King Arnulf of the East Franks. Shortly after becoming emperor, Arnulf became paralyzed and returned to his native Germany, and Formosus himself perished. When Stephen VI took the papacy, the crowning was still in dispute. Stephen had closer ties to Lambert and wanted to reinstate his ally, and the Cadaver Synod was a means to delegitimize Formosus and all of his decisions as pope. Stephen ordered Formosus's 9-month-old corpse be clothed and actually brought to the courtroom, and he appointed a deacon to speak on the departed's behalf. During the sham trial, Stephen accused the cadaver of everything from perjury to violating canonical law. What was left of Formosus was found guilty and thrown into the Tiber River. But the trial itself was so controversial that Stephen's reign only lasted a few more months, until he was stripped of his papal seal and executed. If you like this video, please press like, subscribe and click the notification bell button, for you to be updated on my next video. Thank you.